In the harsh world of the lands between, one ravaged by selfish tyrants and meddling outer gods, pure acts of kindness are hard to come by. Perhaps this is why I found Miquella's character to be so fascinating, who, in a world so corrupted by the pursuit of power, was a refreshing change of pace. You can imagine my shock then when Elden Ring's first and only DLC came out, and set Miquella on a completely different path, while doing very little to connect it with his story in the base game. So let us understand Miquella's story, his motivations, and why I think his character was greatly diminished following Shadow of the Erdtree. By the time the Tarnished reaches the lands between, the once shining Golden Order has more or less failed its people. Its crowning jewel, Leyendell, has long been abandoned, with Morgott, its self-appointed king, clinging to the vestiges of his mother's kingdom. It's not much better over at Stormveil either, where Godfrey's last descendant has resorted to the most disgusting and depraved ways of obtaining power, all in a futile attempt to preserve the land he's been given. Marika's Age of the Erdtree has obviously failed, yet nobody has the will to change it. They're merely clinging to the status quo, trying to relive their former grandeur. Nobody except for Miquella. Despite being raised during the height of the Golden Order, he eventually became its biggest opposer. He watched how it failed to cure him and his sister of their tragic afflictions, how it cast out the weak and downtrodden, and most problematic of all, how little control Marika and Radahn actually had over their own kingdom. So Miquella rejected the Golden Order, but merely rejecting it wasn't enough. He would create a new one of unalloyed gold, that would right the wrongs of the order that failed him and so many others. An order of kindness, compassion, and acceptance, one free from the influences of the outer gods that had caused them so much suffering. So Miquella went to work. He planted the Haligtree and watered it with his own blood. He created his own band of knights, and built the city of Elphael to house his subjects and oversee the creation of his kingdom. On the surface, Miquella's actions don't seem particularly noble. Building a new kingdom has been attempted countless times throughout the many ages before the Erdtree, mostly with self-centered intentions. But Miquella's insistence on such a complete reformation seems to imply his ambitions went beyond just simply obtaining power. He was already one of the strongest candidates to succeed Queen Marika, given his Empyrean status, so I think it's safe to say that just ruling over the lands between wasn't his goal. Miquella also chose not to align himself with an outer god, unlike his mother before him, which undoubtedly placed him at a disadvantage. In my opinion, these aren't the actions of someone who just wants a kingdom to rule over. These are the actions of someone who genuinely wanted to change things. And change things he did. Tales of Miquella's sanctuary spread all over the lands between, becoming a beacon of hope for those persecuted by the Golden Order. Countless beings would make pilgrimage to Miquella's lands. His followers even built Ordina, the liturgical town, as a way station for those seeking respite on their way to the Haligtree. The journey was long and arduous, but for those who finally reached their destination, Miquella welcomed them with open arms, building them their very own town around the trunk of the Haligtree, providing the permanent home they were longing for. It didn't matter if they were an Albinauric, a Misbegotten, or a Crystalian, Miquella embraced them all. Sure, you could argue that this was Miquella's way of spreading his influence across the lands, and creating a society of people who idolized him. But let me remind you, these are some of the weakest and most persecuted species in all of Elden Ring. They offer very little to Miquella in terms of military or political power, and that's not even mentioning the things he did that he had seemingly nothing to gain from, like attempting to cure his half-brother Godwyn's accursed death, acts which seem to have been motivated by genuine compassion. When Miquella started to notice the stagnation of his Haligtree and the repeated failures of his attempts to cure his sister, he embedded himself into the Haligtree, hoping that both him and his tree would grow together, curing him of his eternal childhood. But the plan would tragically be cut short when his deranged half-brother Mohg would kidnap the slumbering Miquella, hoping to use him to usher in an age of his own, bringing Miquella to the Mohgwyn dynasty in Siofra River, which is ultimately the state we find him in when we fight Mohg ourselves. You're left with the feeling that maybe, had it not been for Mohg's intervention, that Miquella would have been able to fulfill his plan, and heal the lands between from the consequences of the shattering. I absolutely adore tragic hero figures in FromSoft games. It's what makes characters like Vike, Gale, and Artorias so interesting. People who share roughly the same goals and ambitions as us the player, and it's up to us to finish what they started and honor their legacy. I initially had Miquella in this same category, a character who, yes, had their flaws, but ultimately had noble ambitions at heart. And when he was revealed to be the central figure of the DLC, I was beyond excited to see how his story would progress. But unfortunately, as you can probably tell from the title of this video, I was not a fan of Miquella's characterization in Shadow of the Erdtree at all. It had turned Miquella's tale, one of hope and a longing for a better world, into a convoluted tapestry of contradictory actions. My two main Elden gripes, if you will, with Miquella's story in the DLC are his out-of-character grand plan and his unforeshadowed consort. Let's start with Miquella's grand plan. As we probably know by now, Miquella's entire existence up until this point is defined by his inability to complete anything he begins. His city, his tree, and his order being evidence of this. Miquella realizes this himself, which is why, in the base game, he embeds himself into the Haligtree to cure himself of this curse and ascend to godhood. He's then tragically kidnapped by Mohg before he can complete his plan, which perfectly falls in line with Miquella's characterization. The DLC, however, heavily implies that it was Miquella who orchestrated his removal from the Haligtree by charming Mohg into doing his bidding, and used Mohg to gain access to the Shadow Realm. Once there, Miquella would cleanse himself of his flesh, his emotions, and even his Great Rune, and approach the gates of divinity where he would finally ascend, same as his mother did before him. On the surface, I don't have any issues with Miquella trying a different method of attaining godhood, as he's been shown to be a very pragmatic individual who isn't discouraged by failure. My main issue with this second plan of his is how little it connects to his story in the base game. What even is the point of Miquella embedding himself into the Haligtree if he's just going to get Mohg to kidnap him? Why didn't he just go to Mohg in the first place? Why is it Mohg specifically that he needs to get to the Shadow Realm? Why did he even use the Gates of Divinity? Doesn't that go against his whole thing of not following in his mother's footsteps? These are all questions that desperately need answers that the game gives us very little information on, leaving almost everything up to speculation. Yes, From Software lore has always been about fan theories and personal interpretations, but never to this extent. You need at least some concrete evidence to build your headcanon around, but in the case of this plotline, there's just too many holes in it for me to be meaningfully invested. Another big issue I have is Miquella's sudden decision to migrate to the Land of Shadow. His entire story in the base game has been centered around Malenia and the Haligtree, yet he abandons them in order to ascend. I always thought that Miquella's main motive was to cure his sister and his city, and that achieving godhood was just a means to an end for him. In the base game, it made sense that we stormed into Elfile and murdered his sister without him interfering, because he was presumed dead by that point. But later on we find out he was actually just wandering around in the Land of Shadow. I mean, we can literally fight Miquella with Malenia's Great Rune and Remembrance in our inventory, and he says nothing about it. The person who motivated him to start this whole thing, the reason he even founded his own order in the first place, is dead just so he can go play piggyback with his half-brother. Speaking of his half-brother, I think it's time to touch on perhaps the most controversial aspect of the DLC, Miquella choosing Radahn as his consort. This part of the story is rightfully criticized for having almost no foreshadowing in the base game and having massive chunks of it left unexplained when it eventually does happen, and I agree wholeheartedly. The fact that the base game established a strong connection between Miquella and Godwyn, with Miquella attempting to cure him of his half-death, his prayer in the description of the Golden Epitaph sword, and what appears to be a statue of Godwyn embracing Miquella and Malenia at the Haligtree, it would make complete sense for Miquella to attempt to revive him now that he needs a suitable consort. Even Radahn's death as a prerequisite to entering the Land of Shadow can fit into Godwyn as Miquella's consort. Maybe Radahn halting the stars was preventing Godwyn's true death at Castle Sol, but now that Radahn's dead, Miquella can finally attempt to bring back his beloved brother. Radahn, on the other hand, has next to no interactions with Miquella in the base game. The closest thing resembling a connection was Malenia's fight with Radahn and Caelid, which at the time, we assumed was due to the shattering and not because Malenia was secretly doing Miquella's bidding. But in the DLC, we discovered that Miquella had actually chosen Radahn as his consort long ago, making him swear a vow when they were children, which frankly comes out of nowhere. It's like if you finished the Ring City in DS3, only to find Solaire there instead of Gale, and fought him as the final boss instead. Hold up, was that actually kind of fire though? If Radahn was foreshadowed as well as Godwyn, Miquella having to choose between them could have served as a great plot point, and Miquella's decision to ultimately go with Radahn would have carried much more weight. But as it stands now, Radahn being the final boss of the DLC just feels like a hollow attempt at bringing back one of the most beloved characters in the base game. But even if Radahn was adequately foreshadowed, there's still a gigantic piece of the puzzle missing. Does Radahn even want to be Miquella's consort? We're never explicitly told that Radahn agreed to Miquella's childhood vow, and even if he did, we don't know if he's still willing to comply now that he's a decorated hero of the Golden Order, the same order Miquella wholeheartedly rejected. If Radahn doesn't want to be Miquella's consort, then our fight with him at the Gates of Divinity is unbelievably tragic. We're basically fighting a puppet operated by Miquella, which paints Miquella in a whole new, much more sinister light. But if Radahn, one of the most honorable warriors in the Lands Between, agreed to be Miquella's consort, then why are we even fighting them in the first place? Miquella's Age of Compassion can't be that bad if Radahn is willing to go with it, which makes our decision to kill them both one of the worst things that have ever happened to the Lands Between. The YouTuber Garrulous Goldmask made an amazing video going into even more detail regarding this topic, which I definitely recommend you go watch. But in conclusion, I seriously don't know why FromSoft chose to conceal this seemingly crucial detail about Radahn's motivations. I was originally going to have a section here criticizing Miquella's trademark ability to charm people, and how it undermined his followers' loyalty to him, but after doing a bit of research, I realized it wasn't clearly defined enough for me to form an argument around. We don't know for sure if Miquella possesses full-on mind control, or just the ability to influence the people around him, nor do we know how far this influence can extend. But I find it highly unlikely that any of his followers in the base game, excluding Mohg, were under his spell. I've seen the theory that perhaps Malenia was charmed from the beginning, explaining why she was undyingly loyal to him, but that theory completely ruins Malenia's character in my opinion. She is the enforcer of Miquella's new order because that order was founded in order to cure her, not because Miquella forced her to do his dirty work. But regardless, most of my issues with Miquella are separate from his charming ability. In fact, I actually think it was done quite well in the DLC with the whole followers of Miquella subplot and their conflicting paths at the end. It's even foreshadowed in the base game, with the description of the Bewitching branch and Malenia calling Miquella the most fearsome Empyrean. The overwhelming consensus regarding Miquella after Shadow of the Erdtree is that he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his subjects' own free will, in order to achieve absolute power. My problem doesn't lie with FromSoft trying to make Miquella quote-unquote evil, but my problem is that, in order to get him there, his story and motivations were altered to the point where pre- and post-DLC Miquella are practically two different characters, with neither one of them reaching their full storytelling potential. After finishing up Shadow of the Erdtree and watching Miquella's final prayer, I was left feeling empty. I was waiting for a revelation, the missing piece of the puzzle that would finally make this convoluted plot click. But in the end, you're left with nothing. I'm sorry to end this video on such a negative note because I truly do love Elden Ring and its story to death, and I assure you that this channel won't devolve into endless ranting about games I supposedly love. But when I was making my L-File video and was reading up on Miquella's story, I remembered just how much I disliked the direction they took his character and the whole promised consort fiasco. But now that that's over with, I'm thinking of making another area breakdown, maybe of Leyndell or Inner Ilum, or maybe even an area from a different Souls game like the Dreadheap or the Two Painted Worlds. So in the meantime, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a spectacular day.